I am teacher Tiffany, and today I am going to teach you how to tell a story in English. Are you ready? Well then, let's jump right in. The first step to telling a story in English is to decide the basic story. In other words, come up with a basic idea of what you want to talk about. For our example, the basic story is about a young man who traveled around the world with his friends. The second step to telling a story in English is to decide the background. In other words, figure out where the story will take place. For our example, the background is Paris. The third step to telling a story in English is to decide the characters. In other words, deciding who will be the focus of your story. For our example, the characters are John, his friends, and a taxi driver they met in Paris. The fourth step to telling a story in English is to decide the climax. In other words, you need to come up with an event or situation that will get the attention of the one listening to you. For our example, the climax is a car accident in the middle of the night. The fifth step to telling a story in English is to decide the conclusion. In other words, you need to figure out what the ending of your story will be. For our example, the conclusion is no money, but they made lots of friends. The sixth and final step to telling a story in English is to decide the lesson learned. In other words, you need to determine what lesson or lessons you want to teach people through your story. For our example, the lesson learned is always do the right thing and good things will happen. Here's the story. Last year, John and his friends decided to take a trip around the world. They visited tons of countries, but one of their favorite places was Paris. It was beautiful. They loved all of the museums and the people, but one night something happened that they would never forget. After a night of hanging out, they were driving along a dark road. Then suddenly, they slammed into the back of a taxi. For a moment, they thought about speeding off, but then they saw that the driver had been hurt. So, instead they decided to stay and take responsibility for what they had done. They called for help and took the taxi driver to the hospital. Then they paid for his entire medical bill. A few days later, after the taxi driver had recovered, he thanked them over and over again for not leaving him on the side of the road. He introduced them to his family, and they all spent a wonderful time together. So, even though the young men had no more money, they did have some new friends. Now, it's your turn.